Keep your mop off my marble floors, Charlotte Reed snapped, her voice slicing through the lobby like glass. Her heels clicked against the polished stone, as if they owned every echo, every reflection. This is an executive space, not your janitor's workshop. David Hale didn't flinch. He simply rested his hand on the mop handle, eyes steady, unhurried. Funny thing, he said, his voice low but carrying. I used to design the soundproofing in this building's boardroom. You might want to thank me the next time your quarterly call doesn't echo. The words hung there, sharp and cold. For the briefest moment, the crowd of assistants and junior managers milling through the lobby froze. A janitor saying that? Her face twitched, the faintest crack in her practiced smile, before she dismissed him with a wave of her manicured hand. If you've ever wanted to see a man in overalls calmly take apart arrogance piece by piece, drop a like right now. And subscribe, because what happens next in this skyscraper isn't just about a mop and a bucket. It's about how power collapses when the wrong person gets underestimated. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Don't get clever with me. You're here to clean. That's all. Her words rolled like marble across steel, smooth and merciless. She loved moments like this. Public reminders of who stood above and who crawled below. David's voice, though, never rose. That's what you see, he said, adjusting the worn strap of his cart, calm, even, unshaken. But what you see isn't always the whole picture. Inside, his thoughts brushed against the memory of his daughter, Grace, waiting for him in their small apartment across town. She deserved a father who carried his dignity like armor, even if the world saw him on his knees with a mop. She was the reason he never let humiliation stick. She was the reason he'd taken this job after walking away from a career most of these executives would have envied. The crowd shifted again. Executives, interns, receptionists pretending not to watch but unable to look away. A janitor who wouldn't cower. A CEO who wouldn't bend. The air itself grew taut, like the hum before feedback in a sound system. Charlotte scoffed, turning slightly as if to remind herself she stood wrapped in designer fabric, her diamond bracelet flashing under the chandelier's light. You're replaceable, she said, her voice soft but poisonous. Don't forget that. David slid his mop back into the bucket, slow and deliberate. Replaceable? He tilted his head. Maybe on paper, but in life, some things don't substitute so easily. He didn't explain, he never did. Let them puzzle it out, until the moment came when they'd see for themselves. And deep down, David knew. Charlotte Reed had just picked the wrong man to humiliate. Where are you watching from? Because when the crisis hits, no amount of corner offices or designer heels will save. Her only the janitor she dismissed will. David didn't move as Charlotte's words lingered, her heels striking the marble like a metronome of power. She turned on her heel, signaling the conversation was over in her mind, and swept toward the bank of elevators. Assistants scrambled to follow, carrying binders and tablets stacked like shields. The janitor had been dismissed, again. But David's steady eyes never left her back as the elevator doors closed. He rolled his cart forward, the wheels squeaking faintly against the polished stone, and bent to wring out his mop. Humiliation didn't sting him the way it once might have. What cut deeper was the memory of Grace, his daughter, eating her dinner alone at their small kitchen table. Every insult he endured was weighed against her smile, her future. That was the trade he made daily, and he made it willingly. Still, whispers threaded the air around him. A young intern leaned toward a colleague. Did you hear what he said? About designing the boardroom? Another answered with a nervous laugh. Probably a lie. He's just trying to look important. The dismissal stung sharper than Charlotte's words, because the disbelief was casual, unthinking, the kind that buried dignity under 1,000 tiny cuts. David pushed his cart toward the service corridor, the narrow, dim-lit artery that snaked behind the gleaming corporate facade. The smell changed here, bleach, dust, and the faint hum of old wiring in the walls. He knew every sound in this building, every vibration of its hidden bones. The irony never left him. He had once sat in meetings with architects, engineers, and contractors, debating the acoustic dampening of these very walls. Now, he cleaned the scuff marks left by the people who never knew his name. In the elevator above, Charlotte Reed glanced at her reflection in the mirrored panel. She hated when staff forgot their place. It wasn't just about control, it was about order, reputation. If people thought janitors could talk back, what message did that send about leadership? She adjusted her bracelet, a diamond catching light, and forced the image of the man's calm defiance from her mind. Yet, unease remained, small but insistent. Back on the ground floor, David parked his cart near the maintenance closet. He leaned against the wall, pulled out his phone, and saw a text from Grace. "Dad, you coming home late again? It's okay, I'll keep dinner warm." His chest tightened. She never complained, never accused, just quiet acceptance, the same acceptance he modeled for her. But beneath it, he knew, was a longing, one he tried desperately to fill by being present whenever he could. He slid the phone back into his pocket and straightened. Dignity wasn't something the world granted him anymore. It was something he had to hold on to himself, piece by piece, against the erosion of every condescending glance. In the lobby again, two executives were talking near the reception desk. "Board meeting tomorrow," one muttered. "Charlotte's kid will be there again. She never goes anywhere without those headphones." The other raised an eyebrow. "She lets her daughter sit in. That's risky." A shrug. "She says it keeps her calm. Kids, different." David caught the fragments as he walked by, his steps silent on the stone. He knew the model they were talking about, the noise-canceling pair Emily always wore. He'd recognized them immediately the first time he saw her. Top of the line, delicate circuitry, precision engineering. He also knew how fragile they were, how a single cracked joint could shatter their balance. He pushed through the maintenance door, but the words clung to him like static. Emily Reed, the girl who shadowed her powerful mother like a quiet phantom. David remembered the way she clutched those headphones with white-knuckled hands, how her shoulders hunched when the world pressed too loud. He recognized it because he had seen it in Grace once, when life's noise became unbearable and only silence could save her. The mop water rippled as David dropped the head into the bucket. He thought of Charlotte's polished dismissal, her certainty that he was nothing more than replaceable labor. She had no idea how closely their worlds were about to collide. Above, Charlotte's office glittered with the trappings of wealth: mahogany desk, modern art, floor-to-ceiling windows that swallowed the city skyline. She reviewed tomorrow's agenda with clipped precision: quarterly reports, investor updates, and her daughter seated quietly in the corner with her headphones. The child was the only softness in Charlotte's life, the only piece of her world she couldn't command into order. Back below, David stored his mop, closed the closet door, and checked his watch. Grace would be waiting, but he knew one truth that pulsed louder with each passing hour. Crises didn't ask permission. They arrived suddenly, stripping away wealth, power, and arrogance. And when they did, someone like him, someone invisible, was often the only one who could set things right. The marble floors shone as if nothing had happened, but beneath their surface, tension was already building. Tomorrow, when the boardroom filled and Charlotte Reed's empire flexed its power, everything she believed about control and superiority would collapse in the face of one small human crisis. And David Hale would be standing in the middle of it. The morning of the board meeting rose with glassy light spilling across the city skyline, bouncing off steel and glass towers like a silent fanfare. Inside the skyscraper, the building pulsed with unusual energy. Executives in tailored suits streamed through the lobby, their polished shoes clicking on marble. Assistants clutched binders, screens glowed with projected numbers, and the air hummed with the scent of coffee and perfume. David Hale arrived through the service entrance, uniform neat, but worn, pushing his cart along the back corridor. The sounds of the lobby filtered through the walls, rising voices, hurried footsteps, laughter designed to impress. He knew today wasn't just any meeting. It was one of those meetings, the kind where Charlotte Reed gathered her empire in a gleaming room of glass and mahogany to remind the world she controlled both numbers and people. He parked the cart near the side hallway, his eyes scanning the freshly waxed floor. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every executive striding across the lobby believed the shine beneath their feet was natural, inevitable, as if marble polished itself. He wrung out his mop, the smell of bleach sharp in the air, and told himself again. Grace's college fund, Grace's future. That's why he endured. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and Charlotte Reed emerged, sharp as a blade. A navy power suit draped over her shoulders like armor, diamonds flashing at her wrist. Behind her, Emily trailed, clutching her noise-canceling headphones, shoulders rounded against the buzz of voices. The child's gaze flicked across the room, never landing for long. Charlotte's presence drew every eye. Executives straightened, interns stiffened. And yet, David noticed the subtle fragility of the girl who walked in her mother's shadow. Emily's small hands tightened on the headphones, as if they were a lifeline. David's eyes softened. He knew what it was to watch your child fight battles the world didn't understand. Charlotte swept past the janitor without a glance, her perfume trailing behind her like a banner. To her, he was part of the building, furniture, background, a detail too minor to see. But Emily's eyes lingered a moment longer, flicking to his cart of tools and mop. She said nothing, only adjusted the band of her headphones and followed her mother into the elevator. David's chest tightened with an old ache. Grace at that age had worn a similar look when the world grew too loud, small, clenched, desperate for silence. He leaned against his cart, feeling the sting of invisibility, then forced himself back to work. Humility was his armor, but every now and then, it cut deep. On the executive floor, the boardroom glistened like a stage. A mahogany table stretched across the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled daylight across polished chrome. Wealth and power radiated from every detail, except for the girl in the corner seat, headphones already snug over her ears, legs drawn up to her chest. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, commanding attention. "We'll make this quick," she said, voice clipped. "Investors expect clarity, not excuses." Her executives nodded, laptops glowing. But her eyes, for a fraction of a second, flicked to Emily. Relief softened her expression. The child was quiet. For now. Back downstairs, David emptied his mop bucket, the water sloshing into the drain. He glanced at the clock. The meeting would stretch for hours. He thought of Grace's message from the night before, promising to warm leftovers until he came home. The ache in his chest sharpened. She deserved more than this. More than a father cleaning up after people who sneered at him. Still, he told himself, survival came first. Dignity didn't pay rent. In the lobby, whispers spread. "The kid's in the meeting again," someone murmured. "She can't handle noise. Those headphones are the only thing keeping her steady." Another voice answered, "What if they break?" A laugh followed. "Don't worry, Charlotte can buy 10 more pairs if she needs them." David's hand stilled on the mop handle. His jaw tightened. They didn't understand. Money didn't fix everything. He'd worked on those circuits once, knew how delicate the balance was. A crack in the joint, a severed wire. No credit card could buy calm in the middle of a storm. Above, Charlotte's meeting rolled on. Slides projected, numbers debated. The boardroom pulsed with the rhythm of control. But in the corner, Emily fidgeted, adjusting her headphones again and again. The band had loosened. The left hinge groaned faintly. She pressed her palms against the sides, her lips trembling. Charlotte noticed, eyes narrowing, but forced herself back to the charts. Control. Always control. Yet, in the quiet between words, a small, sharp sound broke through. The faint crack of stressed plastic. Emily froze. Her breath quickened. The hum of the city outside seemed to roar louder, and while no one else in that room realized it yet, David Hale, downstairs unseen, already knew the crisis was beginning. The faint crack echoed louder in Emily's mind than in the room. She froze, eyes wide, hands clutching her headphones, as if squeezing them tighter could keep the world from breaking in. Her breath came shallow, quick. To her, the boardroom's voices transformed into sharp knives of sound, bouncing off glass walls, stabbing through her calm. Charlotte Reed's attention faltered. She noticed the tremor in her daughter's hands, the sheen of panic rising in her eyes. For the first time in the meeting, her composure slipped. She flicked her gaze to Emily, then back to the glowing slide deck, torn between image and instinct. The investors droned on, oblivious. The hinge on Emily's headphones bent further with a faint squeal. One side sagged lower. A small gasp escaped her lips. audible enough to break through the rhythm of financial jargon. A few heads turned, brows furrowed, but they quickly redirected their focus. This was Charlotte's child. Better not to stare. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. Emily pressed her palms hard against her ears, trying to trap the silence, but it was already leaking away. The hum of laptops, the scrape of pens, the shuffle of leather chairs, it all came rushing in. Her body curled tighter in the seat, a fortress against noise. Charlotte's hand twitched at her side, longing to reach out, but she didn't. Power demanded distance, composure. She had a reputation to maintain. Downstairs, David Hale polished a chrome rail in the lobby, cloth moving slow, steady. But his mind wasn't on the task. He remembered the whispers. What if the headphones break? His gut clenched. He knew that sound, the faint crack of stressed plastic. He'd heard it in the labs years ago, back when he worked as a sound engineer. The hinge design was always the weak point. His cloth stilled. Something was wrong. Up above, Emily's lip trembled. Her hands shook. The hinge gave way with a final snap, and the left ear cup dangled helplessly. She froze, paralyzed, then whimpered. A sound so small, so fragile, yet it sliced through Charlotte Reed's fortress of control. The boardroom stilled. Eyes darted. A cough broke the silence, then faded. Investors glanced at each other, then at Charlotte. The girl began rocking, her fingers clawing at the broken headphones, tears welling fast. The noise, the scraping of pens, the thrum of ventilation, the shifting of suits, hit her like a storm. Charlotte's pulse spiked. She moved quickly to Emily's side, crouching down. "Emily, sweetheart, it's okay," she whispered, her voice almost pleading. But the girl couldn't hear comfort. The storm was louder. Executives shifted uncomfortably, their practiced masks faltering. This wasn't part of the meeting. This wasn't controllable with slides and contracts. One whispered to another, "Should we call someone?" The other shook his head. "It's just a meltdown. She'll calm down." Their words dripped with impatience, not understanding. Charlotte's hands trembled as she tried to fix the headphones, snapping the hinge back, but the plastic resisted. The fracture was fatal. She gritted her teeth. Diamonds sparkled on her wrist as her strength faltered against cheap plastic. For all her power, her wealth, her command, she couldn't restore this one fragile shield for her child. Down in the service corridor, David abandoned the railing. His cart rattled as he pushed it faster, instincts pulling him toward the elevator. He didn't have proof yet, but his gut screamed the truth. The building carried vibrations differently today. Somewhere above, silence had broken. In the boardroom, Emily's sobs rose, piercing, raw. Executives avoided eye contact, staring at papers, screens, anything but the CEO's unraveling daughter. Charlotte felt the heat of their judgment, their silent scorn. This was weakness. This was disorder. Her hands tightened around the broken headphones, rage and helplessness colliding. Emily pressed her face into her knees, rocking harder. Charlotte's voice cracked. "Please, baby, just breathe, just—" But Emily's world was gone, ripped open by sound she couldn't filter. David stepped into the staff elevator, pressing the executive floor button with a forceful thumb. His cart jostled with the motion, tools rattling faintly inside. He closed his eyes briefly, Grace's face flashing in his mind. Grace at 10 years old, curled in the corner of their kitchen, trembling at the crash of city sirens outside. He knew this battle. He knew how to fight it. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. David wheeled his cart into the polished hallway, the hush of carpet swallowing his steps. The boardroom door loomed ahead, faint muffled sobs seeping through. His pace quickened. Inside, Charlotte's polished mask finally cracked. Desperation filled her eyes. She turned toward the door as it creaked open, and there stood David Hale, uniform smudged, hands steady, cart by his side. The room shifted. Executives blinked in confusion. A janitor in their boardroom? Charlotte's lips parted, ready to scold, but the words stuck. Something in his calm gaze, the quiet assurance of his posture, froze her. David's eyes went to Emily first, her trembling, her rocking, the broken headphones in her lap. then to Charlotte, powerful, helpless. And in that moment, the entire room waited, breath held, for what the janitor would do. The boardroom's silence was heavier than the city skyline outside its windows. All eyes shifted from the sobbing child to the man in the doorway. The janitor with a cart of rags and tools, standing where no one like him was ever meant to stand. Charlotte Reed's diamond-clad hand froze in mid-motion, caught between shielding her daughter and defending her pride. For the first time that morning, she didn't know what command to give. David Hale stepped inside slowly, his presence steady, deliberate. He wasn't hurried. He wasn't nervous. His gaze swept the room once, but he gave no acknowledgement to the stunned executives who whispered behind raised hands. His focus landed squarely on Emily, rocking in her chair, broken headphones clutched in trembling fingers. "Don't," Charlotte whispered, her voice sharp, low, but cracking with desperation. "This is not your place." David didn't answer right away. He approached with calm steps, each one deliberate, his cart rolling quietly over the carpet. He stopped just shy of the table, close enough to see Emily's tears streaking down her cheeks. He crouched slightly, bringing his line of sight nearer to hers. His voice was quiet, low enough to reach only her. "Hey, I've seen those before," he murmured, eyes on the headphones. "Good model, just needs a bit of care." Emily's rocking slowed for half a heartbeat, her attention snagging on the tone more than the words. His voice wasn't commanding, wasn't urgent. It carried no pressure, only steady assurance. Charlotte's chest tightened. Her instinct screamed to pull her daughter away, to push this man out of her sight. But another part of her, the mother, not the CEO, hesitated. Emily's sobs had faltered for the first time. Executives exchanged glances. One leaned toward another and whispered, "What's he doing?" The other shrugged, incredulous. "Trying to fix headphones?" Their disbelief filled the room like static. David extended his hand, slow, palm up, not to Charlotte, but to Emily. "May I?" he asked gently. His eyes softened, remembering Grace's small hands clutching her headphones at home when the world grew too sharp. He had spoken the same way to her once, guiding her through storms no one else understood. Emily's fingers trembled, resisting at first. Then, as another ripple of sound surged through the room, a chair squeaking, a laptop shutting, she whimpered and let the broken headphones slide into his hand. Charlotte's breath hitched. For a CEO who dealt daily in billion-dollar negotiations, the surrender of her daughter's lifeline to a janitor was almost unbearable. Yet, she couldn't stop it. David straightened, turning the headphones over in his calloused hands. His fingers traced the hinge, his eyes narrowing with recognition. Yes, exactly what he'd expected. Stress fracture in the plastic joint. Wire tension at risk. He reached into his cart, pulling out a small precision screwdriver and a roll of electrician's tape, tools that had no place on a mop bucket but always traveled with him. "Those aren't cleaning tools," one executive muttered. "No," another whispered back. "They're engineer's tools." Charlotte's eyes locked on him. A question flickered behind her polished mask. Who is this man? David knelt beside Emily again, setting the cart closer. He spoke softly as he worked. "You'll hear a few clicks," he explained, hands moving with practiced precision. "Don't worry, that's just me setting the hinge back." His voice was calm, measured, designed not for the room of executives, but for the frightened child clutching her knees. Emily's gaze fixed on his hands. Her breathing slowed fractionally, the rhythm of panic easing into something else, anticipation, focus. Her world narrowed to the steady motions of the janitor fixing her broken shield. Charlotte crouched nearby, torn between fury and awe. Fury that this man had intruded into her fortress of power. Awe that, somehow, her daughter was responding to him more than to her. A faint click sounded. David tightened the hinge, reinforced the joint with tape, and smoothed the band carefully. He adjusted the wiring, tested the sound. Then, with a quiet nod, he held them out. "Try now." Emily hesitated. Her small hands reached, trembling, then slid the headphones back on. For a moment, silence didn't return. She froze, waiting. Then the noise dimmed, the storm muffled. Her shoulders sagged. A shaky breath escaped her lips, followed by stillness. The boardroom released its own breath. Executives who had been holding their chests exhaled. The moment stretched, delicate, unshakable. Charlotte's throat tightened. Relief washed over her, sharp and unfamiliar. Her daughter had calmed, not because of her, not because of wealth or influence, but because of the janitor she'd dismissed. David stood, slow and steady, slipping his screwdriver back into the cart. He didn't gloat. He didn't boast. He simply gave Emily a small, reassuring nod before turning his attention back to the room. The executives stared. Charlotte rose to her feet, diamond bracelet flashing, but words failed her. She could command markets, intimidate rivals, crush competitors. Yet, she could not explain away what had just happened, and David Hale, the janitor she'd humiliated, had just proven, without a word of pride, that control could break as easily as plastic, and calm could be restored by hands the world overlooked. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. For a heartbeat, the boardroom held its silence like glass balanced on a ledge. Emily sat curled into her chair, headphones secure again, her trembling subdued. The storm had passed, yet the room didn't relax. The executives watched David Hale as if they'd seen something they weren't meant to. An intrusion, yes, but also a revelation. Charlotte Reed straightened, every inch of her polished presence strained between gratitude and fury. She smoothed her blazer, lifted her chin, and tried to regain command. "Thank you," she said at last, her tone clipped, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. But her eyes were still on him, searching, measuring. David only nodded, slipping the screwdriver into his cart. His movements carried no fanfare, no need for acknowledgement. He'd done what needed doing, the same way he once had in sound labs years ago, calibrating devices no one else understood. Now, instead of applause, he accepted silence and suspicion. An executive at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "We should resume," he suggested, voice hesitant. But the balance of the room was already broken. They all knew something had shifted. Charlotte's gaze flicked to her daughter, then back to David. A thought clawed at her pride. Why had Emily responded to him, not her? Why had calm returned at the touch of a janitor instead of the comfort of a mother who commanded everything else? The contradiction gnawed at her, an unwelcome reminder that control was not absolute. David began to wheel his cart back toward the door, silent as a shadow. But before he reached it, a voice stopped him. "Wait." Charlotte's word carried less sharpness this time, though it still held the weight of command. David turned slightly, his expression steady, unreadable. Her jaw tightened. "How did you know what to do?" He hesitated for only a breath, then answered evenly. "I've seen it before." His eyes flickered just briefly with memory. Grace's frightened face years ago, her trembling in their kitchen corner, the broken headset he'd once repaired while whispering calm into the chaos. But he didn't explain, not fully. The executives exchanged glances. One whispered, "He's not just a janitor." Another muttered, "What was that with the tools?" The room buzzed with doubt and curiosity, fragile threads pulling at the polished image of their CEO's authority. Charlotte's cheeks flushed. She waved her hand dismissively, as if to erase the moment. "Well, whatever it was, you've done your part. You may go." David gave no protest, no sign of offense. He only nodded once, his cart rattling softly as he moved toward the door. But inside, he felt the familiar sting of being brushed aside after delivering more than anyone expected. Dignity, again, was something he had to hold for himself. Emily's eyes followed him as he left, her small face calm now, but curious. She didn't say a word, but her gaze lingered long after the door closed. Down in the service corridor, David parked his cart against the wall. He leaned on the handle, exhaling. He'd intervened because he couldn't bear watching a child drown in noise no one else could silence. But he knew the risk. Stepping into that boardroom uninvited had painted a target on his back. Charlotte Reed wasn't the type to forgive a breach, even one that saved her daughter. Still, he didn't regret it. Grace's face was all the proof he needed. His daughter had taught him long ago that silence was priceless, and sometimes the smallest fix could hold an entire world together. Upstairs, Charlotte dismissed the meeting early, investors filing out with murmured thanks, their eyes darting with speculation. In the hallway, whispers spread fast. "Did you see that?" one asked. "The janitor? Fixed what she couldn't?" Another replied, "Never thought I'd see Charlotte Reed powerless." Their voices carried farther than they intended. In her office, Charlotte sat behind her mahogany desk, staring out over the skyline. Emily sat nearby, headphones intact, drawing quietly on a pad of paper. For once, the CEO's mind wasn't on numbers or projections. It was on the man who had walked into her boardroom and solved in minutes what her wealth couldn't. The humiliation of needing him stung, but so did the strange relief of knowing someone else had understood her daughter. That night, David returned to his apartment. Grace greeted him with a warm smile, dinner reheated and waiting. As he sat down, she asked, "Rough day?" He gave her a tired grin. "Just the usual." He didn't mention the boardroom. He didn't need to. But as Grace began talking about her classes, David's thoughts drifted. He knew the story wasn't finished. Charlotte Reed wasn't a woman who left loose ends, and he had just become one. In the quiet of his apartment, over the clink of cutlery and the hum of city traffic outside, David realized the crisis he had stepped into wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning, the skyscraper buzzed louder than usual. Executives whispered in, clusters, assistants darted between offices, and everywhere David Hale turned, he felt eyes on him. The story had spread. The janitor who fixed the CEO's daughter's crisis. In the hushed language of corporate gossip, facts blurred with speculation. Some called it luck, others insisted he had training. Either way, David's name was on tongues that had never spoken it before. He kept his head down, mop moving across polished marble, but inside, he knew the balance had shifted. Charlotte Reed wouldn't let yesterday go. Not a CEO who controlled narratives as tightly as she controlled her empire. Sure enough, by mid-morning, 2 security guards approached him in the service corridor. "Ms. Reed wants to see you," one said, their tone clipped, official. Not a request. David wiped his hands on a rag, his mind calm despite the churn in his chest. He had expected this. Quietly, he followed them up the executive elevator, the hum of the ascent sharp in his ears. Charlotte's office glistened under the skyline, a kingdom of glass and power. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, the diamond bracelet at her wrist catching the morning sun. Emily sat near the window, headphones snug, sketching in her pad. She didn't look up, but David noticed the way her shoulders eased when she sensed him enter. "Mr. Hale," Charlotte began, her voice smooth but strained. "Do you understand what you did yesterday?" David met her gaze evenly. "I helped a child who needed it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You interrupted a board meeting. You breached protocol. That room is not your domain." She stepped closer, heels clicking like hammers on marble. "If I hadn't been so distracted with my daughter, I would have had you removed immediately." David said nothing. He let her words hang, the air thick with her authority. Yet, he didn't drop his gaze. His silence wasn't submission. It was steel. Charlotte bristled. "And yet—" Her voice faltered for a moment, rare uncertainty breaking through. She glanced toward Emily, who still sketched quietly, her calm unshaken. "You succeeded where no one else could." That admission, quiet though it was, landed heavier than her threats. David finally spoke. "Money can replace headphones," he said softly, "but it can't replace calm. It can't rebuild trust once it's gone." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She hated the truth of it. "How do you know this?" she demanded. David considered his answer. He could reveal everything now, his past as a sound engineer, his years designing the very technology her daughter depended on. But not yet. The time wasn't right. Instead, he offered a sliver. "Experience," he said simply, his voice low, steady. The silence stretched. Charlotte studied him, her sharp eyes searching for cracks, for weakness. None appeared. Finally, she turned away, waving him off as though to dismiss her own doubt. "You may return to your duties, but understand this. Whatever happened yesterday does not give you a place in this office. You remain staff, nothing more. David inclined his head once, not as submission, but as acknowledgement. He turned, guiding his cart toward the door. But before leaving, he caught Emily's eyes. She had stopped sketching, her pencil hovering in the air. For just a moment, she smiled at him, small, fleeting, but real. That smile followed him back into the service corridor, sharper than any words Charlotte had thrown. Later that afternoon, whispers grew louder. She kept him in her office for 10 minutes, one assistant gossiped. 10! Do you know how rare that is? Another replied, he's dangerous. If people think a janitor knows more than the board, that's a problem. David ignored the talk, but he could feel the ripple spreading. His invisibility was gone, and invisibility had always been his shield. That night, at home, Grace noticed the weight in his shoulders. Rougher than usual? She asked gently. He smiled faintly. Something like that. Want to talk about it? He shook his head, though the urge pressed at him. How could he explain that he had stepped into the center of power and come out not crushed but questioned? That a CEO had looked at him not as background, but as something she couldn't quite control? Instead, he ruffled her hair. You just focus on your exams, he said softly. Let me handle the noise. Grace studied him, suspicion in her eyes, but let it go. As he washed dishes that night, David thought again of Charlotte's words. Nothing more. Yet he also remembered the falter in her voice, the admission she hadn't wanted to give. Crisis had cracked her certainty, and he had stepped into that crack like light through glass. He dried his hands, staring out the window at the glowing city. This wasn't over. The storm he'd calmed in the boardroom was only the beginning. Charlotte Reed was a woman who built walls around her empire, but he had just shown her that walls crumble when sound finds its way through. The following week unfurled like a taut string ready to snap. Every corridor David Hale mopped carried a whisper. Every executive lounge he passed seemed to hush when he entered. The story of the boardroom crisis hadn't faded. It had grown, retold in fragments, twisted into versions that made him sound less like a janitor and more like a mystery. David kept his pace steady, uniform crisp, cart rattling softly as always. He let the whispers wash over him. That was how he'd survived these last years, letting arrogance roll off him like watered-down glass. But now he could feel the shift. He wasn't invisible anymore, and visibility came with danger. On the executive floor, Charlotte Reed lived in that same tension. Meetings ran, investors called, but her thoughts drifted again and again to the man who had walked into her boardroom uninvited. His words, money can replace headphones, but it can't replace calm, echoed like a truth she didn't want to admit. She hated needing anyone, especially him. Yet she couldn't forget the way Emily had smiled after he fixed what wealth couldn't. That tension erupted during a strategy session midweek. Charlotte stood at the head of the mahogany table, slides glowing on the wall, when Emily shifted in the corner. The hinge of her repaired headphones creaked faintly. Emily froze, hand tightening. Charlotte's throat constricted. A boardroom full of executives watched her. Panic threatened to rise. The memory of last week threatened to repeat itself, and she couldn't endure it again. Helplessness, humiliation, exposure. Ms. Reed? An executive asked, noticing her falter. Charlotte masked it quickly, clearing her throat. Continue, she commanded, though her hand trembled beneath the table. Later, when the meeting ended, she lingered in her office, staring at Emily sketching by the window. The child was calm for now, but Charlotte knew the truth. Calm was fragile, and for reasons she couldn't yet accept, the only man who had steadied that fragility worked in a janitor's uniform. Meanwhile, down in the service corridors, David took a quiet break in the supply room. He pulled a small cloth from his pocket, wiping down a precision screwdriver he always carried. It was habit, ritual. Years ago, in labs filled with engineers and humming circuits, he had done the same thing before, fine-tuning prototypes. He'd left that world, yes, but the skills never left him. The door opened suddenly. One of the receptionists peeked in, hesitant. Mr. Hale, Emily's headphones. They're not working right. She asked for you. David blinked. He hadn't expected that. A child's direct request cut sharper than any order from above. He rose without a word, card abandoned, screwdriver tucked neatly back into his pocket. Upstairs, Charlotte bristled when he entered her office. "Who authorized?" she began, but her words fell when Emily looked up, eyes wide, and whispered, "He can fix them." The CEO's polished mask cracked again, pride warred with desperation. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "Fine," she muttered. David crouched by Emily's chair, calm as ever. "What's the problem this time?" he asked softly. She handed him the headphones, fingers trembling only slightly. "It buzzes," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. David tilted the set, listening as he adjusted the band. He nodded. "Wire strain. Easy fix." His hands moved with precision, repairing what others couldn't even identify. Within minutes, the faint buzz faded, the quiet restored. Emily's shoulders sagged with relief. Charlotte watched, arms crossed, unable to deny the transformation. Again. "You shouldn't be the one doing this," she snapped, though softer than before. "It isn't appropriate." David straightened, handing the headphones back. "Appropriate. Or not, it works," he replied calmly. His eyes flicked to Emily, not Charlotte. "That's what matters." Emily smiled faintly, a smile that landed like a blade between Charlotte's pride and her fear. The moment simmered until David turned to leave, but Charlotte's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hale." Her words were sharp, but quieter. "I don't know what you used to be, but I will find out." David paused at the door. He didn't turn back, but his voice carried. "Then you'll see more than you expected." When the door closed behind him, Charlotte sat heavily at her desk. For the first time in years, control felt slippery in her hands. That night, David returned home. Grace looked up from her homework, sensing the weight in his shoulders. "You helped someone again, didn't you?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly, tired. "Something like that." She frowned. "You can't keep hiding who you are forever." Her words struck deeper than she knew. David washed his hands at the sink, the smell of bleach still clinging to him. His daughter was right. The facade of invisibility was cracking. And when it did, Charlotte Reed wouldn't just see a janitor. She'd see the man he used to be, and the man he still was. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. Charlotte Reed had never tolerated uncertainty. Her empire was built on sharp lines, clean numbers, decisions rendered with surgical precision. Yet all week, one question refused to leave her mind. Who is David Hale? The janitor who fixed what money couldn't. The man her daughter trusted without hesitation. The worker who stood in her boardroom like he belonged there. Her private investigator's report sat unopened on her desk. She hadn't asked for it officially. She couldn't admit to anyone in her company that she'd been shaken enough to dig into the past of a man who mopped her floors. Still, she couldn't bring herself to open it, not yet. Meanwhile, David moved quietly through his routines. Mop, rinse, replace supplies, every task steady, precise. But inside, he felt the pressure building. He'd stepped too far into their world, and once you were seen, you couldn't go back to being invisible. Grace had noticed it too. That morning, as he tied his boots, she'd said softly, "Dad, it feels like you're walking into something bigger than cleaning floors." He hadn't answered. He couldn't, not when she was already carrying enough weight of her own. The moment of collision arrived in the form of a corporate gala. The event occupied the top 2 floors of the skyscraper. A dazzling show of wealth. Crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes, string quartets filling the air with practiced notes. Executives arrived in tailored tuxedos, partners in gowns that shimmered like liquid. Charlotte Reed presided over it all, diamond earrings catching the light. Emily at her side, in a simple dress, headphones still snug. David had been assigned to the cleanup team, stationed near the service doors with a rag and cart, invisible among the glitter. Yet, as the evening unfolded, he couldn't help but notice Emily's discomfort. The music, the clink of glasses, the overlapping chatter. Her hands tightened around her headphones, her shoulders stiffened. Charlotte noticed too, though she masked it behind polite smiles and small talk with investors. Her eyes flicked toward Emily again and again, worry gnawing beneath her polished surface. The breaking point came when one of the violinists adjusted a faulty speaker, producing a sharp burst of feedback. The sound shrieked across the room, and Emily flinched violently. The crowd winced, laughed nervously, then carried on. But Emily's calm shattered. She pressed her hands against her ears, rocking slightly, tears welling. Charlotte froze mid-sentence, her glass trembling. She bent down, whispering urgently, but Emily couldn't hear her through the roar in her own head. Panic spread across the girl's face. David's cart rattled as he pushed through the service doors. He hadn't been called, he hadn't been summoned, but he moved anyway, instinct stronger than protocol. His steps cut through the glittering crowd, a janitor crossing marble meant for executives. Gasps followed him, whispers rippling. He crouched by Emily, speaking softly. "I know, it's too much, but I can fix it." Her trembling slowed just enough for her eyes to flick toward him. Recognition, trust. She held out her headphones with shaking hands. Charlotte's chest clenched. Around her, investors murmured, confused, curious. A janitor, kneeling at the center of her gala. Again. David's hands moved quickly, screwdriver flashing in the chandelier's light. He adjusted wiring, bypassed the faulty filter, reinforced the band. All the while, he kept his voice calm, steady, grounding Emily in his rhythm. Within minutes, the buzz faded, the storm dulled. Emily slipped the headphones back on, shoulders dropping as silence returned. Relief swept across her face. She leaned against him for just a moment before retreating back into herself, calm restored. The crowd erupted in murmurs. "Did you see that? How did he? Who is he?" Charlotte rose slowly, her face pale, her authority cracked in front of her entire empire. Gratitude warred with humiliation again. She turned toward David, lips parted, but the words caught. One of the investors stepped forward, eyes wide. "That was remarkable," he said. "You've got a sound engineer working as a janitor?" The words hung heavy, electric. David's past dangled on the edge of exposure. He didn't flinch. He slipped his screwdriver back into his pocket, nodding once to Emily before standing. "Just doing what I know how to do," he said quietly. The executive stared. Charlotte's mask of control fractured, her silence louder than any denial. David turned toward the service doors, cart rattling as he left the gala floor. But he knew it wasn't over. The whispers had grown teeth now. The mystery was no longer containable. His hidden life was bleeding into the open, and Charlotte Reed wasn't going to let it rest. Back in his apartment later, Grace watched him scrub grease from his hands, silence stretching. "Dad," she said gently, "people are starting to see you." David looked at her, weariness in his eyes. "Yeah," he murmured, "and when they see the whole picture, everything changes." The truth was no longer a shadow. It was coming, sharp and unstoppable. By Monday morning, the gala whispers had hardened into something sharper. David Hale could feel it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a hallway, in the sideways glances from executives who had never noticed him before. The janitor who fixed the CEO's daughter wasn't just a curiosity now. He was a problem, a disruption to the neat hierarchy Charlotte Reed demanded. He pushed his cart through the service corridor, the wheels squeaking faintly, tools rattling in their tray. Each sound felt louder than usual, echoing against the walls of his thoughts. He had spent years carving out invisibility as a shield, but now the shield was gone. He had stepped into their world twice, and both times he had succeeded where power failed. That wasn't something they would forget, or forgive. Charlotte, meanwhile, sat in her office overlooking the city. Her diamond bracelet glimmered faintly as she tapped her desk, staring at the unopened file. The report on David Hale sat waiting, a manila folder that might answer the questions clawing at her. She had resisted all weekend, but the image of him kneeling beside her daughter at the gala, calm, certain, undeniable, wouldn't leave her. Finally, with a sharp inhale, she opened it. The words hit like cold steel. David Hale, former senior sound engineer, specialized in acoustic technology and sensory modulation systems. Patents registered, widowed, left corporate sector after wife's passing. Custodial work begun 3 years later. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. A sound engineer. Not a janitor, not really. That explained the tools, the precision, the quiet certainty. Yet it unsettled her more than it comforted her. Why would a man with that background be mopping her floors? What kind of choice or failure had led him here? Downstairs, David continued his work as if nothing had changed, though the shift in atmosphere pressed on him. A pair of interns lingered by the vending machines, whispering too loudly. "He's not just a janitor, you know. My boss said he used to design tech worth millions." Another snorted. "Then why's he scrubbing floors? Sounds like a failure to me." David caught the words but kept moving. He had no interest in defending himself. He'd built his life around grace, not reputations. Yet the sting lingered. By midday he was summoned again, this time not by guards, but by Charlotte herself. Her assistant appeared in the corridor, eyes wary. "Ms. Reed would like to see you, now." David wiped his hands on a rag, nodded, and followed. The office was colder this time. Charlotte stood by the window, arms folded, the skyline blazing behind her. Emily sat quietly nearby, sketchbook in hand, headphones snug, safe in her small world. Charlotte didn't waste time. "I know who you are," she said sharply. "David Hale, former engineer, patents, career, and yet here you are, pushing a mop." Her words dripped with accusation. David met her gaze evenly. "That's correct," she frowned. "Why? Why abandon it all to work here, invisible?" For a long moment, David said nothing. Then his eyes softened. "Because when my wife died, my daughter needed me more than the world needed my work, so I walked away." The answer struck Charlotte like a blow. She glanced at Emily, her heart tightening, though she masked it quickly. "That doesn't excuse trespassing into my boardroom, or undermining me in front of my people." David's voice remained calm. "I didn't trespass. I stepped in when no one else could help your daughter, that's all." The words landed heavier than she wanted to admit. For all her anger, she couldn't erase the truth of them. Emily looked up from her sketchbook then, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mom, he helps." Charlotte faltered, pride and vulnerability colliding. She turned back to the window, struggling to compose herself. "This changes nothing," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're still staff, remember that." David inclined his head, not in submission, but acknowledgement, and turned to leave. Emily's eyes followed him again, her trust clear. Outside the office, the hallway buzzed with executives pretending not to listen. They had heard enough to piece together the truth. Their janitor had once been more accomplished than many of them. The hierarchy trembled. That evening, David returned home. Grace was waiting with dinner, her smile warm despite the fatigue in his shoulders. As they ate, she asked softly, "Did they finally see you today?" David gave a tired smile. They saw more than they wanted to. He didn't add the rest, that the line between his past and present had blurred too far to separate now. His hidden life was no longer hidden, and with that exposure came risk. For him, for Grace, and for the fragile calm he had tried to protect. Charlotte Reed now knew who he was, and that meant the storm ahead would be bigger than any he had faced. The building seemed to vibrate with rumors by the next morning. David Hale's name moved through the skyscraper like a current, whispered in elevators, murmured across cubicles, carried in hushed tones down the polished halls. Engineer, widower. Why, is he here? His invisibility had been stripped away, and every glance felt heavier than the mop in his hands. David tried to ignore it. His focus stayed on the work, scrubbing scuffs from the lobby floor, polishing the chrome railings, replacing bulbs in silent corridors. But each task was shadowed by the knowledge that he was no longer just a janitor in their eyes. He was a question, and questions made the powerful uneasy. On the executive floor, Charlotte Reed leaned against her desk, arms folded, staring at the skyline. She had read every line of his file, every patent number, every award. She hated what it meant, that the man she had dismissed, the man who had twice steadied her daughter, had once stood in the very ranks she commanded now, and he had walked away, voluntarily. That defiance unsettled her more than his presence. Emily sat in the corner, drawing quietly, headphones snug. Every so often, she looked up at her mother and said nothing, as though she sensed the storm brewing behind Charlotte's diamond-hard eyes. By mid-afternoon, the inevitable clash arrived. Charlotte summoned David again, this time in front of others. He entered the boardroom to find not just her, but half a dozen senior executives waiting. Their suits gleamed, their eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment. Charlotte's voice rang out, clear, sharp. "Mr. Hale, do you know why you're here?" David's gaze moved around the table, then back to her. "I imagine because I'm no longer invisible to you." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. One smirked, another scribbled notes. Charlotte's jaw tightened. "You've disrupted my company twice, once in the middle of a board meeting, again during a gala in front of investors, and both times you crossed lines that were not yours to cross." David remained calm. "Both times your daughter was in crisis. I did what needed doing." Her hands pressed flat against the polished mahogany. "That's not the point. You've unsettled order. Hierarchies exist for a reason." David's voice was quiet, steady. "Order means nothing if it fails when it's needed most." The words landed like a stone dropped into water. Ripples moved across the room. An executive on Charlotte's left murmured, "He's not wrong." Another hushed him quickly. Charlotte's diamond bracelet caught the light as she straightened. "You think you've proven something? That fixing a child's headphones makes you indispensable?" David shook his head. "Not indispensable, just not replaceable in that moment. That's the difference." The silence that followed was heavier than accusation. For once, Charlotte had no sharp retort ready. Emily, who had been brought into the room quietly by her mother, shifted in her chair. She looked directly at David and whispered, "You help." The simplicity of her words pierced through the tension more effectively than any argument could. Charlotte's composure cracked, if only for a second. Her eyes flicked to her daughter, then back to the man standing across from her. In that flicker, the boardroom saw what she couldn't fully admit, that her control faltered where her child was concerned, and that the janitor held the peace she could not command. One executive leaned forward, voice cautious. "Perhaps, Ms. Reed, his skills are more useful than his title suggests." Charlotte shot him a glare sharp enough to silence. "We do not elevate staff above their place," she snapped. But even as she spoke, doubt threaded her tone. David didn't press. He only inclined his head, calm and unshaken. "I don't need elevation. I only do what I know how to do." That answer burned her more than arrogance would have. He wasn't playing for status. He wasn't climbing. He was simply steady. And steadiness was a power she couldn't bend. The meeting dissolved soon after, Charlotte waving him out with clipped words. But the damage was done. He had stood his ground in front of her board, revealed not through boasting, but through action and restraint. The executives had seen, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Later that evening, in his small apartment, David sat at the table with Grace. She ate her dinner quietly, watching him with those keen eyes that had always read him too well. "They know now, don't they?" she asked. David exhaled slowly. "Yes, they know. Does it change anything?" He gave a faint smile, tired but resolute. "Everything and nothing." Grace frowned. "You're not afraid?" He shook his head. "Fear doesn't matter. What matters is why I'm doing this, and who I'm doing it for." Her eyes softened, the weight of unspoken gratitude passing between them. As the night stretched, David looked out the window at the glowing city. The storm had grown larger, more public, and soon there would be no turning back. But the crisis resolution path was clear. When wealth and hierarchy failed, the truth of his skill and purpose would be undeniable. Charlotte Reed might still resist, still claw to hold her power, but she had already glimpsed what frightened her most. There were battles money couldn't buy her way out of, and David Hale, the janitor she tried to dismiss, was the proof of it. The week closed under a storm of whispers. David Hale's name no longer drifted like rumor. It carried weight. From lobby clerks to board members, everyone knew the story. The janitor who fixed what money couldn't, the man who steadied the CEO's daughter while her mother, the most powerful woman in the building, stood helpless. Charlotte Reed felt it most sharply. The more she tried to reassert control, the more she felt her grip slipping. Her executives had seen her falter. Investors had whispered questions after the gala. And through it all, Emily's trust for the janitor grew more obvious. A quiet rebellion against the polished image Charlotte had spent years curating. On Friday morning, the final collision came. Another board meeting, another day of marble floors and sharpened suits. David was called to polish fixtures just outside the boardroom, a deliberate choice Charlotte hadn't made but hadn't stopped either. He could hear every word through the half-open door. An executive cleared his throat. "Ms. Reed, the incident at the gala raised concerns among investors. They've asked, directly, if the man who resolved it is on staff in an official capacity. They want assurance." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "He's maintenance, nothing more." Another voice interrupted, firmer this time. "With respect, Ms. Reed, that's not how it looked. The investors saw him succeed where the rest of us failed, and frankly, perception matters as much as numbers." Murmurs rippled around the table. Charlotte's pulse pounded in her ears. To admit David mattered was to admit she didn't control every variable, and yet the room was turning against her, slowly, like a tide she couldn't order back. The door creaked then, and all heads turned as David stepped inside, not intruding, not demanding, but steady, card at his side. He hadn't meant to interrupt, but his presence felt inevitable, as if the building itself had carried him into the spotlight. Charlotte straightened, diamond bracelet flashing. "You shouldn't be here." David's gaze swept the room once, then landed calmly on her. "I didn't come to take anything from you. I came because your daughter needed help. Twice." His voice was quiet, but it filled the room with more weight than a shout. Emily, seated quietly at the far end, looked up then. Her small voice broke the tension. "Mom, he helps." The words cracked Charlotte's armor. In front of her board, in front of her empire, she felt the truth laid bare. All her wealth, all her control, had failed at the moment her child needed her most, and the man she dismissed as invisible had succeeded. For a moment, silence reigned. Then one executive spoke softly. "Sometimes the strongest asset is the one we overlook." Charlotte's throat tightened. She wanted to lash out, to reassert dominance, but Emily's eyes, calm now, safe because of the man she'd scorned, held her still. Slowly, painfully, she exhaled. "Very well," she said at last, her tone clipped but trembling beneath. "Mr. Hale, you've made your point. Perhaps there is value in more than appearances." David inclined his head, not triumphant, only steady. "It's never been about appearances," he replied. "It's about people. That's something worth protecting, whether you're in a boardroom or a broom closet." The room shifted then, executives exchanging glances. For once, Charlotte didn't correct him. David turned, guiding his cart toward the door. His dignity intact, his role clear. Not a conqueror, not a climber, but a man who stood where he needed to, when it mattered most. And for Emily, that was enough. That evening, back in their apartment, Grace listened quietly as David recounted the day. She smiled faintly. "So, they finally saw you." David chuckled softly. "They saw enough?" He didn't need their titles or their approval. He had his daughter's trust, his dignity, and the knowledge that in moments of crisis, real worth always revealed itself. The city lights flickered beyond the window. Somewhere high above, Charlotte Reed sat in her glass tower, replaying his words, her daughter's voice, and the cracks in her certainty. For the first time, she realized the truth. Money and power didn't define strength. People did. And the janitor she tried to erase had just proven it to her entire empire. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Title: Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?